Love didn't scare them because it was intense. It scared them because it removed control. And that's the part most people misunderstand. They think avoidant behavior comes from lack of feeling. It doesn't. It comes from a nervous system that associates closeness with loss of autonomy. For someone who needs control, love is not soothing. It's destabilizing because love asks for presence, consistency, responsiveness, and those things require internal regulation, not distance, not ambiguity, not power positioning. So when you showed up with emotional availability, it wasn't comforting to them. It was exposing. Your steadiness highlighted what they were managing. Your consistency revealed what they were suppressing. Your attunement made visible the parts of themselves they kept contained through distance. This is where confusion starts. Because from your side, love felt natural. You weren't demanding. You weren't chasing. You were simply present. But presence is not neutral. To someone whose safety comes from control, presence reduces their ability to regulate through withdrawal. It interrupts the strategy that kept them feeling secure. And that's why love didn't pull them closer. It triggered self-protection, not because you were too much, but because closeness required something they couldn't sustain. When control is the coping mechanism, emotional intimacy feels intrusive, not invasive. Intrusive because it asks them to stay emotionally engaged, without escape routes, no silent exits, no emotional buffers, no ambiguity to hide behind. And ambiguity is crucial to control-based attachment. It allows them to remain connected without being fully present. It keeps power asymmetrical. They decide when to lean in, when to pull back, when to respond, when to disappear. This is regulation for them. So when you introduced consistency into the system destabilized, not externally, internally. Their nervous system registered threat, not danger, loss of control. And loss of control feels unsafe to someone who learned early that safety depended on self-containment. This is why reassurance didn't help, why clarity didn't soothe, why patience didn't build trust. Those things only work when closeness is desired. Here, closeness was tolerated only when it could be managed. Your emotional availability removed that management. You weren't unpredictable. You were reliable. And reliability demands reciprocity. That's the part they couldn't meet. So instead of rising to intimacy, they reduced the bond. They created distance. They slowed responsiveness. They introduced inconsistency, not to hurt you, to restore internal equilibrium. This is not conscious manipulation. It's conditioned survival. Control-based systems don't feel powerful. They feel fragile. They rely on distance to keep emotions from overwhelming them. So when love arrives, without games, without tension, without uncertainty, it feels like pressure, even if it's gentle, even if it's kind, even if it's safe. This is why they could enjoy you in certain doses, moments, bursts, but not continuity. Continuity required them to stay emotionally present, and presence required regulation, which they outsourced to distance. So love became threatening, not because it asked for more, but because it asked for real. And real cannot be controlled without cost. This is the core reframe. They didn't pull away because you were too intense. They pulled away because your love reduced their ability to stay defended. And defenses feel like safety until they're challenged. That's what happened. Your love challenged a system built on control, not intentionally, simply by being what it was. To understand this fully, you have to separate control from power, because they're not the same thing. Power comes from internal stability. Control comes from fear of instability. And people who rely on control are not trying to dominate others. They're trying to contain themselves. This is where many narratives go wrong. They frame avoidance as arrogance, coldness, indifference. But internally, it's often the opposite. It's containment, a nervous system that learned early that emotions are dangerous. When they're shared, that closeness leads to overwhelm. That dependency equals vulnerability. So instead of regulating with another person, they regulate through distance. Distance gives them space to breathe. Distance reduces stimulation. Distance keeps emotions predictable. And predictability feels like safety. This is why emotional independence is often confused with emotional avoidance. From the outside, it looks like strength. They don't need much. They don't ask for reassurance. They don't lean. They seem self-sufficient. But what you're actually seeing is a system that learned not to rely, not to soften, not to open, because openness once cost them something. So when you entered the picture with emotional availability, you unknowingly disrupted that system, not by asking for closeness, but by offering it consistently. Consistency is the real destabilizer, because consistency removes ambiguity, and ambiguity is the buffer that keeps control intact. When things are unclear, they stay in charge. They decide what something means. They decide how close it gets. They decide when to engage. But when you're clear, when you're emotionally present, when your energy is steady, they lose that interpretive control. They can't reframe your behavior to suit their regulation strategy. They can't downplay it. They can't dismiss it, because your presence is undeniable. This is why reassurance doesn't land. This is why communication doesn't fix it. Because the issue isn't misunderstanding. It's nervous system incompatibility. Your system was oriented toward connection. Theirs was oriented toward containment. So the more open you were, the more their system signaled threat. Not because you were unsafe, but because intimacy required them to feel things they had learned to suppress. This is where control steps in. Control restores distance. Control slows momentum. Control creates space. And from the inside, that feels like relief, even if externally it looks like withdrawal. This is also why they often feel calmer after pulling away, while you feel unsettled, because the move that destabilized you stabilized them. Your systems were regulating in opposite directions. You regulated through connection. They regulated through separation. So when the bond deepened, your system felt safer, and theirs felt exposed. That mismatch is the real problem. Not love, not effort, not timing. Mismatch, and no amount of patience, can convert one regulation strategy into another. This is important to understand, because it removes self-blame. You didn't overwhelm them by being loving. You didn't scare them by wanting consistency. You didn't push them away by being present. Your presence simply asked something their system couldn't give. And instead of confronting that limitation, control stepped in to compensate. Distance became the solution. Ambiguity became the shield. Silence became regulation. This is why things often felt better when you pulled back, why they seemed warmer when you stopped leaning in, because distance restored their equilibrium. But that equilibrium was built on your absence, which meant connection was never truly shared. It was conditional, available only when it didn't require emotional engagement. This is where people often get stuck. They think, if I just give more space, things will stabilize. And sometimes they do, but at a cost. The cost is intimacy. The cost is depth. The cost is mutuality. What you get instead is a controlled connection, one that feels calm, because it's shallow, predictable, because it's limited. And that's why it never satisfied you, because your system wasn't looking for regulation through distance. It was looking for resonance. This is also why love felt threatening to them, not because love was dangerous, but because love requires shared regulation. It requires being affected. It requires staying present when emotions rise. And for someone who learned to survive by self-containment, being affected feels like losing control, even when the effect is positive, even when the emotion is care, even when the connection is safe. Their system doesn't distinguish between good intensity and bad intensity. It just registers activation, and activation triggers defense. This is why the bond stalled, why it plateaued, why it cycled. Because control-based systems can't deepen without destabilizing. So they hover at a tolerable distance, close enough to connect, far enough to stay regulated. And you felt that tension constantly. The push-pull, the almosts, the moments of closeness, followed by withdrawal. That wasn't confusion. It was regulation. Once you understand this, something important happens. You stop personalizing the distance. You stop interpreting it as a reflection of your worth. You stop asking what you could have done differently, because the answer isn't behavioral. It's structural. Two nervous systems with opposite strategies trying to form a bond, and no amount of love can override regulation. This is why love alone was never going to be enough. Not because love wasn't real, but because it was mismatched. Your love moved toward presence. There's moved away from it, and control filled the gap. This understanding doesn't make you cold. It makes you clear. You no longer chase availability. You no longer negotiate consistency. You recognize when distance is being used as regulation. And you can't compete with that. Nor should you. Because intimacy requires two systems, willing to be affected, not one person staying open, while the other stays defended. This is the reframe. Love didn't fail. Control took over. Because closeness was intolerable. And once you see that, the confusion dissolves. Not emotionally, cognitively. And clarity is stabilizing. Once this understanding lands, something important shifts inside you. Not emotionally first. Structurally, you stop relating to the experience as a personal failure. And that alone changes how it lives in your body. Because before this clarity, you were trying to solve it from inside the bond. You were adjusting behavior, tone, timing, availability. You were asking yourself, what version of you might finally make the connection feel safe? But now you see, there was no version of you that could have done that. Because the issue wasn't how you loved. It was how closeness was metabolized. On the other side, that realization doesn't arrive with relief right away. It arrives with stillness. Because when effort falls away, there's space. And space can feel unfamiliar. If you're used to relational vigilance, you might notice moments where your system wants to reach, to clarify, to soothe, to reestablish equilibrium. But now, you recognize that impulse. You don't obey it automatically. You observe it. And observation is the beginning of choice. This is where integration happens, not by rewriting the past, but by changing how your system responds to similar signals going forward. You start noticing control patterns earlier, not as red flags, as information. You notice when someone regulates through ambiguity, when they avoid emotional specificity, when closeness is permitted only in controlled doses. And instead of leaning in harder, you pause, not to test, not to withdraw, but to see if mutual regulation exists. This is subtle, but it's decisive, because now you're no longer trying to earn presence. You're assessing capacity. That's a very different posture. You're no longer asking, how do I show up better? You're asking, is this system capable of shared intimacy? And you don't ask it anxiously. You ask it neutrally, because you're no longer invested in the answer being yes. That neutrality is new and powerful. It doesn't mean you care less. Once this understanding lands, something important shifts inside you. Not emotionally first. Structurally, you stop relating to the experience as a personal failure. And that alone changes how it lives in your body. Because before this clarity, you were trying to solve it from inside the bond. You were adjusting behavior, tone, timing, availability. You were asking yourself, what version of you might finally make the connection feel safe? But now you see, there was no version of you that could have done that. Because the issue wasn't how you loved. It was how closeness was metabolized. On the other side, that realization doesn't arrive with relief right away. It arrives with stillness. Because when effort falls away, there's space. and space can feel unfamiliar. If you're used to relational vigilance, you might notice moments where your system wants to reach, to clarify, to soothe, to reestablish equilibrium. But now, you recognize that impulse. You don't obey it automatically. You observe it. And observation is the beginning of choice. This is where integration happens, not by rewriting the past, but by changing how your system responds to similar signals going forward. You start noticing control patterns earlier, not as red flags, as information. You notice when someone regulates through ambiguity, when they avoid emotional specificity, when closeness is permitted only in controlled doses. And instead of leaning in harder, you pause, not to test, not to withdraw, but to see if mutual regulation exists. This is subtle, but it's decisive, because now you're no longer trying to earn presence. You're assessing capacity. That's a very different posture. You're no longer asking, how do I show up better? You're asking, is this system capable of shared intimacy? And you don't ask it anxiously. You ask it neutrally, because you're no longer invested in the answer being yes. That neutrality is new and powerful. It doesn't mean you care less. It means you're no longer over-identified with outcome. This is the shift that prevents repetition, not boundaries, not rules, but regulation awareness. You understand now that love doesn't heal control-based systems. Intimacy requires regulation, and regulation must be shared. This clarity doesn't make you cynical. It makes you accurate. You stop assigning meaning where there is only mechanism. You stop taking responsibility for systems you didn't design, and you stop negotiating with dynamics that require you to abandon yourself to maintain them. This is not about avoiding avoidance. It's about recognizing control-based attachment. Before you invest, you don't demonize it. You simply don't enter it, because you understand the cost now, not intellectually, somatically. Your body remembers what it's like to love someone who regulates through distance, and it chooses differently, quietly, automatically. This is the integration, not a lesson you repeat, a posture you embody. And once embodied, it doesn't require vigilance. It doesn't require effort. It just is. You don't explain it to people. You don't announce it. You don't defend it. You live it. And life reorganizes around it. This is where authority emerges. Not performative authority. Internal authority. You trust yourself. You trust your read of dynamics. You trust your pacing. You trust that if something requires control, to feel safe, it's not where you belong. And that trust becomes the foundation of every future bond. Not fear, not hope, trust. This is why understanding this is not about the past. It's about the future. Because once you see the mechanism, you don't repeat the pattern. Not because you're careful, but because you're incompatible with it now. And incompatibility doesn't need resistance. It just doesn't connect. At this stage, something else begins to settle in. Not excitement, not relief, but certainty. A quiet certainty. That doesn't need reassurance. You're no longer waiting for proof. You're no longer scanning for signals. You're no longer trying to decode silence. Because clarity has replaced curiosity, and clarity is stabilizing. You now understand that some dynamics feel intense, not because they're meaningful, but because they're dysregulating. That intensity was never intimacy. It was activation. Your nervous system learned to confuse the two, because activation kept you engaged, kept you hoping, kept you invested. But now, that activation doesn't hook you anymore. You can feel it arise. You can notice the pull. And instead of leaning forward, you stay where you are. This is not self-control. This is self-trust. You don't suppress desire. You contextualize it. You understand where it comes from. You understand what it costs. And that understanding neutralizes its grip. This is how patterns end. Not dramatically, not with declarations, but with disinterest. The dynamic loses oxygen because you're no longer feeding it. With interpretation, you're no longer personalizing behavior. That has nothing to do with you. You see regulation styles clearly now. You see how some people use distance to regain power, how others use ambiguity to avoid responsibility, how closeness is offered conditionally, then withdrawn when it threatens autonomy. And instead of feeling hurt by this, you feel informed. Information replaces injury. That's a major shift because injury keeps you engaged. Information sets you free. You don't argue with patterns anymore. You don't try to prove them wrong. You let them be what they are, and you choose accordingly. This is where emotional maturity actually shows up, not in endurance, but in discernment. You no longer equate patience with depth. You no longer equate longing with love. You no longer equate effort with value. You understand that reciprocal intimacy feels different. It feels mutual. It doesn't require management. It doesn't require emotional gymnastics. It doesn't require silence decoding. And once you've felt that difference, you don't go back. Even if the old dynamic tries to reappear, even if familiarity calls, even if nostalgia whispers, you recognize the cost, and you respect yourself too much to pay it again. This doesn't make you rigid. It makes you aligned. You're still open, still warm, still capable of deep connection, but you're no longer willing to be the stabilizing force in someone else's unresolved system. That role no longer fits, and you don't miss it because you realize how much energy it consumed, how much self-silencing it required, how much presence it stole from your own life. Now, your energy returns to you, not in a burst, in a steady stream. You feel more available, more grounded, more present, not because you're alone, but because you're no longer split. You're not divided between your needs and someone else's tolerance. You're not negotiating your authenticity to preserve connection. You're whole, and wholeness changes what you attract, not magically, mechanically. Your system no longer resonates with partial availability. You no longer respond to push-pull signals. You don't reward distance with pursuit. You don't reward ambiguity with patience. So those dynamics can't anchor to you. They move on. And what stays feels different, slower, clearer, more mutual. This is where the narrative flips. Not from why didn't they choose me, but to why did I stay as long as I did? And that question is not asked with shame. It's asked with compassion. You understand now what you were responding to, what you were hoping for, what you were trying to heal, and you don't judge yourself for it. You integrate it. You see how your empathy, your depth, your capacity for attunement made you susceptible to control-based dynamics. Not weak, but open. And openness without discernment often learns through pain. Now you have discernment, and openness remains. That combination is power, not loud power, quiet power, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that doesn't explain, the kind that doesn't chase. It simply chooses. This is why the shift feels permanent. Not because you decided something, but because your system updated its rules. Your body learned what safety actually feels like. Your nervous system recalibrated its definition of connection. And once that recalibration happens, you can't unknow it. You can't force yourself to find chaos attractive again. You can't pretend inconsistency is exciting. You can't convince yourself that distance is depth. Your body won't cooperate. And that's a gift, because now your body protects you before your mind has to intervene. This is what growth looks like. Not perfection, not detachment, but alignment. You still feel, you still care, but you don't abandon yourself to be chosen. You don't contort yourself to be kept. You don't shrink yourself to be tolerated. You show up fully, and you let the dynamic reveal itself. If it can meet you, you continue. If it can't, you don't force it. There is no drama in that. No closure scene. No final conversation required. Just clarity. And clarity is quiet. This is why, when you look back, you don't feel bitterness. You feel understanding. You see the system. You see the pattern. You see the mismatch. and you release yourself from the story. That release isn't an ending. It's a repositioning. You're no longer inside the dynamic. You're outside of it, observing, choosing, living. This is what emotional adulthood actually feels like. Not hardened, not cynical, just steady. And from this steadiness, everything else becomes simpler. Decisions are easier. Boundaries are natural. Attraction is clearer. You don't need to ask. If something is healthy, your body answers first, and you trust it. This is the place where future connections begin, not from longing, but from resonance, not from fixing, but from meeting, not from control, but from mutual regulation. And that changes everything. If this landed quietly for you, that's not accidental. It means your system is already integrating. You're not late. You're not behind. You're exactly where awareness turns into embodiment. And from here, you don't repeat the cycle. You outgrow it.